And African slaves, Cuba is a diverse mix of races.
It is a society that is by its nature multicolored.
Henry Louis Gates Jr. explores whether Castro's revolution put an end to widespread racism.
Whites and blacks, everybody has the same rights.
But do they?
Racial issues in Cuba are censored.
Prejudice never disappeared.
Cuba, the next revolution. Black in Latin America.
It's difficult for us to think of Cuba beyond a 50-year-old dictatorship just 90 miles south of Miami. The Revolution of 1959, Fidel Castro's conversion to communism 2 years later, the Bay of Pigs, the row over Elian Gonzalez. But these events obscure the shared history between the United States and our closest Caribbean neighbor, dating back centuries, and nowhere is this connection deeper than in race relations. Cuba received about 780,000 African slaves, almost twice the number that arrived in the United States. From the start, black people have profoundly shaped this country's politics, its culture, social identity, and its very way of life. But like their African-American cousins, the Afro-Cuban people have been forced to struggle for racial equality, right through to the present day. When Castro took over, he declared famously that socialism would put an end to the racism that was an endemic part of Cuban society. But has that happened? That's what I'm here to find out. To understand the question of race in the history of Cuba, I'm starting my journey at the very beginning. Christopher Columbus landed here in 1492, but Cuba's economy didn't really take off until the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The Haitian Revolution caused a sudden and massive shortage of sugar, opening doors to Cuban planters to fill that gap. To meet this new demand, they imported a massive number of slaves, hundreds of thousands in the early 1800s. This is Tyro, an old slave plantation where I've been invited to a Santeria religious ceremony, one of Cuba's most important cultural legacies from Africa and slavery. The ceremony starts with the sacrifice to the gods, but especially to one, the god of the pathways, named in Cuba, El Legua. In Yoruba, he's called Eshu Elegbara. It's the same god, the same ritual, the same beginning for Candomblé in Brazil, for Vodou in Haiti, and for Santeria here in Cuba, a clear sign of their common origin with the Yoruba people of West Africa and the Fon people of Dahomey. Cuba didn't abolish slavery until 1886, 21 years after we did. That means that many of these people's great-grandparents could have been born in Africa, and that even some of their grandparents would have been born as slaves. West of Havana, overgrown sugar and coffee plantations dot the countryside, the remains of an enormously profitable and vast slave-fueled economy. By 1840, Cuba had become the largest producer of sugar in the world. It used to be Haiti, but after the Haitian Revolution, the sugar economy fell apart. And that sugar industry here in Cuba was manned by the massive importation of African slaves, hundreds of thousands in the 19th century alone. I've come to the ruins of Angerona, deep in the lush Artemisa province. It was one of the most important slave plantations in the country. Initially, 428 slaves produced coffee, then sugar, on a very large scale. I'm here meeting Professor Carmen Barcia, who's devoted her career to the study of slavery.
What was the effect of the Haitian Revolution on the white people, on the planters?
It fueled the fear of the blacks, the fear that another Haitian revolution could happen here.
The slaves in Haiti began their revolt in 1791, deposing their French colonial masters and declaring their independence in 1804. The specter of that revolution terrified Cuban planters eager to maintain their new dominance in the hugely lucrative sugar industry. So they operated their plantations like prisons.
They began to construct panoptic watchtowers to control everything that went on in both the sugar and coffee plantations. Here we have one of these towers. It's not one of the biggest ones, though. There were some that were much bigger.
So they wanted to watch them all the time?
Yes.
By 1825, all of Spain's American colonies were independent, except for Puerto Rico and Cuba. Cuba's sugar industry was far too profitable for Spain to lose, and slavery was essential to those profits. But the fight for independence from Spain couldn't be suppressed forever. I've come to Santiago de Cuba, 600 miles east of Havana, at the opposite end of the island. It's the country's second largest city, and it was around here that most of the battles for freedom were fought. The man who launched the first war of independence in Cuba was Carlos Manuel Céspedes, that man right there. On October 10th, 1868, he called all of his slaves to a meeting. They had no idea why. And he told them that he was launching a war of independence against Spain, and that they were going to constitute his army, and that they, henceforth, from this moment, were free. I'm sure that was a mind-blowing thing for them to hear. But over the next 10 years, the movement grew into a true war of independence. In 1874, Céspedes was killed by Spanish troops. The war ended in 1878. But just a year later, a new war commenced in which black leaders were even more prominent. The most important of these was Antonio Maceo, the Bronze Titan. I'm here meeting Professor Ada Ferrer, a professor of Cuban history, to understand how a black man could become such a leading national figure when slavery still existed.
Antonio Maceo joined the war in 1868 as a common soldier, was promoted within weeks, maybe even within days, and rose to the rank of general. There was always anxiety about his rise to military power.
Because he was black?
Because he was a man of color, yes. And he was accused of wanting to create another Haiti, and he defended himself really eloquently. And he said, yes, I am a man of color. And because of that, I don't think I am any less than anyone else.
Spain tried to use the fact that Maceo and over half his army were black to feed fears that independence would only lead to another Haiti, a black-dominated republic. But the leader of the movement, a white intellectual named José Martí, dismissed this idea as rubbish and eloquently defended the idea of Cuba for Cubans, calling Spain's bluff.
They said, no. The only people who talk about race war are the Spanish who are trying to divide us. Here, in these years of war, slaves have fought. They have fought together with white men. They have died together. They have shed blood together. Their souls have risen up to heaven together. Out of the war, they created a vision of a nationality that transcended race. In some sense, what that did was make racism an infraction, not against an individual, not against you or me or anyone else, but an infraction against the nation.
To Maceo and his compatriots, blacks and whites were first and foremost Cubans. Their enemy was Spain, not race. They were ahead of their time. I find it astonishing that a black man could rise to the level of general during the War for Independence in Cuba in the decade of the 1890s, when America It never would happen in America. It was 50 years later before we had our first black general, General B.O. Davis.
Right. Yeah, and in Cuba it happened just 8 years after the end of slavery.
As the final war against Spain raged across the Straits of Florida between 1895 and 1898, the United States government cast a weary eye both on the Spanish conduct of the war and on Cuba's multiracial army. Maceo himself was killed in an ambush. As the conflict escalated, the American government sent the USS Maine to protect American interests in January 1898. A few weeks later, the warship mysteriously exploded and sunk in Havana Harbor. Mario Iglesias, a professor of history, has brought me to see its remains.
The cannons and the chains are part of the original battleship.
Original cannon, wow.
Yes, the battleship after the explosion remained sunk in the bay. That plaque shows that the remains of the battleship were partly sunk and they were visible in Havana for 14 years.
How did the American intervention affect the War of Independence?
It is a very important event because it splits Cuban history into two. It puts an end to Cuba's colonial history, to the 400 years of Spanish colonization. It is thought that the explosion of the Maine unleashed a chain of events where the United States intervened in the war between Cuba and Spain and expelled Spain from Cuba.
The war between Spain and America was over in 10 weeks. Cuba was finally independent from Spain. Black and white, rich and poor, Cubans rejoiced. Professor Iglesias has found an exceptionally rare letter congratulating one of the leaders of the war, written by a Black Santeria priest called Vicente Goytisolo. We've managed to track down Goytisolo's descendants in one of the poorest areas of Havana to tell them about this letter. It turns out his family still proudly displays his photograph.
How are you? The kids asked, "Mom, who is that person?" And I said, "This is your great-great-grandfather." And they asked, "Why is he dressed like that?" And I said, "Because he was from the time of the War of Independence, and that's how they dressed."
It's a very, very interesting letter because he shows his nationalistic sentiments. In different parts of the letter, he mentions our land and long live a free Cuba. He includes his address. He lived on Padre de las Casas Street, number 33. Let me read to you what he said in the letter. "You are the God of the earth and all of us." And then he finishes the last line of the letter saying, "Long live free Cuba." And he signs it, Vicente Goytisolo.
It's very rare, very unusual for a black person to have written a letter.
Yes, because many people of this origin, who had come from the world of slavery, didn't know how to write. They were illiterate, and he makes an effort, so the handwriting is a bit bad. It's not the same as they teach you in school. He writes any way he can, but manages to get his point across. The letter is thrilling.
Ah, it's great. So what do you think?
It's really good to know about the history of my family and my ancestors at the time of the War of Independence, which led Cuba to be free.
Unfortunately, things weren't quite as they seemed. Victory over Spain was not quite the same as independence. Soon it became clear that the United States was here to stay.
The nationalistic version is that the Cubans had been fighting Spain for 30 years, but by their intervention with an occupying military government, the US prevented the birth of an independent republic.
In 1902, Cuba was allowed to elect its first president, but the United States effectively remained in control of the island. One form of colonialism replaced another. Did the Americans coming change race relations?
I think so. The official policies of the American government were incredibly racist, and they even tried, during the occupation, to impose segregationist policies. For example, when it came to choosing the staff that would form the police force or the artillery, which used to be multiracial, the US government forced Cubans to create separate bodies of black and white people. But I have to say that there was also a Cuban elite who was racist and cooperated with the military and with the racist policies of the occupying government.
While some white people challenged American attempts to prevent black veterans from voting, America's racist policies were music to the ears of some of the Cuban elite, the descendants of the same people who had maintained slavery for so very long. I've come to the anthropology department of the University of Havana, where a century ago, as a black man, I wouldn't have been welcome. In accordance with the government's official racism, two anthropologists decided to whiten the history of the War of Independence in the most fundamental way.
Imagine if Ulysses Grant had died during the Civil War. And after he died, scientists dissected his body to see whether, from the size of his cranium, he was more European or more, say, Native American.
That's what happened to Antonio Maceo. During the American occupation, on September 17th, 1899, just 3 years after his death, his body was exhumed and examined to determine how black or white he was. Professor Armando Rangel explained this analysis to me.
First, they said it was a beautiful skull. Then they said it was a perfect skull. It influenced ideas of Maceo as a great soldier, a great warrior. It was said that he had the body of a strong man like Hercules.
But Armando, it sounds like they were worried that he might be too black, that they didn't want this great man to look like the African. They wanted him to look like a European.
If Maceo was a superior man, then he couldn't be black. The superior man would have to have European characteristics, and that was really a mistake, a scientific mistake made at the time. It is a curious fact in the history of the Republic. The more these investigations went on, the whiter the images of Maceo became, and his face became more European.
Antonio Maceo suffered these indignities after death. But what happened to the black leaders that survived and should have been celebrated for their role in the War of Independence? I've been allowed access to the National Archives to find out. After Maceo, Quentin Banderas was one of the most popular and powerful black leaders in the revolution. People even wrote poems about him. Was he recognized as a hero, a founding father? This is a letter he wrote to a very distinguished woman, essentially imploring her for financial assistance because he couldn't get a job. He was reduced to searching for jobs, menial jobs, jobs as a custodian, a janitor. His situation never improved. In fact, 4 years later, he was imprisoned, and by order of the president, he was killed. Just 10 years after independence, the promise of a colorblind Cuba seemed a distant dream of a fast retreating past. But in 1908, thousands of former slaves decided the dream could not be allowed to die. I'm standing at the tomb of Pedro Ivanay. Ivanay and his companions demanded rights and equality for black people in the newly independent Republic of Cuba. Pedro Ivanay and the Independent Party of Color declared that they would fight for a racially mixed republic. The white establishment reacted swiftly and viciously. The mainstream press claimed that the black political party would eat the whites alive, equating them with monkeys and with the rats that had caused an outbreak of the bubonic plague. While the sanitation department hunted rats, the military, it was said, was hunting niggers.
And Thomas, look, they look like monkeys. They all look like monkeys. All these black people are made to look like monkeys. Same caricature in America. Black people are always monkeys.
Cuba has historically been a very racist country. There was a tradition that blacks could not enter certain areas within parks because these were white areas. Just like in the United States, where at this stage black people were marginalized. In Cuba, there have never been any segregation laws, but there was actual discrimination.
Pedro Ivane bravely led a revolt, but with the deadliest of consequences. The government massacred 3,000 of his followers. Ivane himself died in 1912, shot in the back while trying to escape. How could the slaughter of thousands of men, most of whom, like Ivane, had recently fought in the War of Independence, possibly be justified?
It is possible that the massacre was carried out in order to satisfy the threat from Washington. That if the Cuban government could not show that they had control and were in charge of the island, the U.S. might intervene again and this time remain in Cuba.
Racist caricatures of black Cubans were just as common in the American press. Cuba itself was always represented as a black child. The massacre, without doubt, was the low point in race relations since independence. While black men could vote, and there were some black elected officials, many white Cubans wanted to quash any memory of their country's vibrant African roots and recreate their identity in the image of Europe and Jim Crow America. Everything black became immoral, ugly, and bad.
This was the carnival that was, if not put together, energized by the black slaves and the poor white people here in Cuba as long ago as the 17th and 18th century. And for just as long, the official culture in Cuba has been trying to repress it, trying to suppress it.
Blacks were forbidden from using African instruments in dancing at carnival. African religions and ritual drumming sessions were banned. A 1906 immigration law appropriated $1 million to whiten Cuba, bringing 600,000 Europeans, mostly from Spain, here to the island over the next 20 years. Black culture, an embarrassing relic of Africa and slavery, was repressed, forced to live underground.
In the first couple decades after independence, black music was considered vulgar. It was the equivalent of jungle music. But there was nothing anyone could do to repress it. It was bubbling up from underground. It was on the street corners, it was in the cafes, it was in the clubs.
It was a musical genre known as song, an irresistibly lyrical, sensual music that somehow expressed the soul of Cuba. Psalm was born in Oriente Province at about the same time that jazz was being invented in New Orleans. I've been invited to a rehearsal of one of the oldest playing psalm bands in the world, the Septeto Típico de Son.
Fantastic, guys, fantastic. Hola.
Welcome, Professor.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Oh, my God.
When were you born?
Me?
Yeah.
In 1926. I am about to be 84.
84 years ago. Was son music legal 84 years ago?
No.
No. Why not? Why not?
Because Back then, they said the septet was black people's business. So if they were playing in a party, the police would come and arrest them. You couldn't play son back then. In Havana, you couldn't play son. You had to play son in hiding. The police would come and would take everybody to the police station.
How much of song music is African? How much is Spanish?
From Spain, it gets the string element, the guitar. But from Africa, it gets the drums, the backing vocals, and the flavor with which the singers perform is much more African than Spanish.
The government's attitude towards song represents a radical turning point in Cuban culture. Despite efforts to suppress it, song kept bubbling up from underground. Even the rich and famous succumbed, and through secret song parties. All that changed officially in 1925.
President Machado, authorized a song band to play at his birthday celebration. And shortly thereafter, the government officially recognized song, allowing it to come up from underground and become a normal, fundamental part of Cuban culture, which it continues to be to this day. It's like meeting living legends in the history of Cuban popular culture. It's pretty fantastic.
President Machado's endorsement of song was part of a larger cultural phenomenon. Cuba's white establishment stopped pretending that it was a Caribbean extension of Europe and began celebrating its racially mixed or mestizo heritage. This movement was called Cubanidad, a blend of white and black to make brown. I've come to the home of Torres Cuevas, the head of Cuba's National Library. He's preparing a meal that is a metaphor for the blended nature of Cuban culture and identity.
Hi, I'm Henry Lewis. It's an honor to meet you.
The concept of Cubanidad starts in the 1920s. It became a way of trying to explain who we were, who we are, these multicultural and multicolored people.
Torres Cuevas is making ajiaco, a kind of stew in which different meats and ingredients blend together.
It's like magic.
This is Cuban ajiaco, made with all the ingredients that lend it a unique quality and taste. I'd like you to try it and tell me what you think.
Gracias. Muchas gracias. Of course. It was very good. And the pork is tender, very tender.
This is one of the dishes that define Cuba.
So this is the cultural essence of Cuba.
What is the ajiaco stew metaphor? That Cuban identity is the result of multiple ingredients that lose some of their original flavor in order to acquire a new flavor. In North America, a black person is anyone who has a drop of black color. In Cuban society, this is very difficult to establish because all of us have that drop. So racial differentiations are extraordinarily false. And this means that when you get to the heart of Cuban society, it is a society that is by its nature multicolored, but multicolored within the individual himself. All these elements are mixed inside each person.
In the 1940s, Cuba officially began to embrace its hybrid heritage. Racial discrimination was criminalized, and intellectuals trumpeted their unique mixed culture, all very different from what was happening in America at this time. Whenever I ask a black Cuban who they are or how they describe themselves, they always say, always, I'm a Cuban who's black. African Americans, on the other hand, almost always say, I'm black and I'm an American. As Cuba's official attitudes towards its black cultural heritage were changing, so too was its economy. The middle of the 20th century saw a real rise in prosperity. American business interests dominated, and American tourists started to flock to Havana's newly built hotels, including some less respectable visitors. This was Meyer Lansky's hotel suite. He ran his entire empire right here. He had a sweetheart deal. Meyer Lansky, the infamous mafia boss, wanted to turn Havana into the Caribbean's Las Vegas. And his influence reached a peak with the return to power in 1952 of General Fulgencio Batista. Historian Graciela Chailloux was a child of Batista's Cuba.
The reason he came to prominence in Cuban society and remained in power for more than 20 years had a lot to do with the fact that he was the guardian of North American interests in Cuba. He was a man who had an extraordinary thirst for power.
Batista, despite appearances, was a mulatto. I wondered if his ancestry affected how black Cubans fared under him.
Batista didn't change the racial segregation that existed in Cuba in any way. Black people were brought to Cuba to be slaves. When slavery was abolished, the living conditions barely changed.
In fact, by 1957, Cuba enjoyed one of the highest per capita incomes in all of Latin America. But the prosperity was not equally distributed. The 1950s saw two different Cubas emerge. One well-off and overwhelmingly white, the other poor and predominantly black. By 1955, riots and anti-Batista demonstrations were rife. His response was to stifle dissent and torture and kill the rebels. A group of revolutionaries, led by a young attorney named Fidel Castro, waged a guerrilla war against him from Oriente province. Commander Victor Drecke joined the rebel militia when he was only 15, and he fought under Che Guevara. He would serve the Cuban army for the next half-century. He's a passionate defender of the revolution. I was only 9 years old when the Cuban Revolution occurred. Can you tell me what it was actually like fighting in the mountains, and then what it was like to be part of that revolution?
Well, for those of us who had the opportunity to be there, they were unforgettable days.
As the war advanced towards Havana, Commander Drecke was involved in progressively more vicious engagements. Despite being outgunned and outnumbered by 10 to 1 at times, Drecke survived the legendary battle that ensured victory over Batista.
At about 6 a.m., we saw a white flag, and someone said to me, "Look, Drecke, they are surrendering. They are surrendering." I did not believe they were surrendering. It was all a bit unreal. So we cried with joy and also with sorrow because there were comrades who had died a few days earlier and they had not managed to see our victory.
12 hours after the fall of Santa Clara, Batista fled the country with 180 of his cronies and over $400 million US. Soon after, Colonel Drecke and Fidel Castro's army rolled victoriously into Havana. Against the greatest odds, the revolution had been won. Given the brutalities and harsh repressions of the Batista regime, there's little wonder that the revolutionaries were greeted as heroes.
We did not think we would live to see the triumph of the revolution. That was an unforgettable moment for all the fighters and for the people of Cuba, who threw themselves onto the streets en masse. Men, women, children, all clapping their hands, celebrating the victory of the revolution. Even some people who did not want the revolution went into the streets to support the triumph of the revolution. Blacks and whites, they were all there.
The government set up a new Ministry of Labor to end racial discrimination in employment. Fidel Castro declared racism to be over, but this made it difficult even to talk about discrimination. Informal racism did begin to disappear, though, and Colonel Drecke attributes this change to the revolution.
In Cuba, everybody has the same right to study, the same right to work, the right to fight to defend the principles of the revolution. Whites and blacks, everybody has the same rights. We cannot say that there is discrimination. Here in Cuba, hardly anyone would dare to say, I do not want my black daughter to marry a white man. I do not want my white daughter to marry a black person. No, because the power of the revolution, the power of ideology, the strength of the dream, the strength of the truth, stops people from saying that.
Not only did Castro's government declare black and white equal before the law, it also began providing free health care and universal access to education, both of which had an immediate and dramatic impact on the poorest Cubans, who for the most part were black. While 3/4 of the population was already literate, in an extraordinary attempt to eradicate illiteracy completely, in 1961, Castro sent out an army of 100,000 teenagers to teach nearly 1 million Cubans how to read and write. Professor Graciela Chailloux, whose father was a lawyer, was one of the children who took part in that crusade.
You were 11, right? 11 years old. When I was 11, I couldn't have left my parents. How far away did you go from your home? Were you alone? And was it terrifying? Were you homesick?
Porque no era yo sola, eran muchos igual que yo.
There were lots of people like me who had left home, and the problem was for those who didn't get the permission from their parents. Those who wanted to go, but their parents wouldn't let them, they did have a serious problem.
How long were you away?
8 meses. 8 months.
Months?
Yes.
My God.
Yes.
You're crazy. You're crazy.
No. El 22.
On the 22nd of December of 1961, Cuba was declared an illiteracy-free territory.
Libre de analfabetismo.
And all the young people who had taken part paraded in the Revolution Square.
Was it Cuba's finest moment?
Yes, I think so. I think so because Fidel said that everybody have to study.
Everyone has a right to study.
Yes.
And so they have to study.
Yes.
Did your parents try to stop you? I would have stopped my daughters. I would have said no, because I would have worried about their safety, especially being girls. Did your parents try to stop you?
No.
No.
No, it was a special moment, and everyone's strength was put into it.
Estaban puestas en función de ese momento.
I'm so moved. I admire your commitment to your country, to your ideals. It's very beautiful. It's very beautiful.
Today, it's so easy to forget how full of hope so many Cubans were when the revolution triumphed. But I guess that's mostly because of what happened next. Castro nationalized American-owned companies, ending U.S. control over the economy. America then canceled its sugar contracts. So the Soviet Union stepped in, becoming Cuba's major economic partner. Soon, Castro declared Cuba to be communist. Not surprisingly, soon after that, the CIA began various attempts to overthrow Castro, culminating in the disastrous invasion of the Bay of Pigs. When the Soviet Union installed nuclear warheads on the island, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. The most terrified I have ever been in my entire life, without a doubt, was October 1962. I was 12 years old, and it was the Cuban Missile Crisis. We all thought we were going to die. I spent the entire crisis, when I wasn't in school, on my knees, praying to God either that the Russians didn't drop the bombs, or if they did, I went to heaven. Seems kind of amusing now. Wasn't amusing back then.
I was a military leader during the October crisis, as we call it, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, as it's called in the rest of the world.
Did you, like me, think you were going to die?
Yes, I thought that I could die. I thought this many times. I fought in the war and I was injured. I could have died then. I was also injured at the Bay of Pigs and could have died then. I always thought I would die. It's not that I am brave, but you decide to die for a cause.
Commander Drecke and Professor Shayu lived through the revolution and played a role in it. Both are quite romantic about it, so you can see why for them, it's a cause worth defending. But younger Cubans have become increasingly critical of the regime in general and of its silence over ongoing racism more particularly. In 1989, international events forced the issue. The collapse of the Soviet Union deprived Cuba of $6 billion of income annually, almost overnight. Tato Quinones, a journalist, lived through the chaos that would soon envelop the island. Tato, I've always wondered how the fall of the Soviet Union, 1989, affected race relations in Cuba and the life of the average black Cuban.
In less than a year, Cuba lost over 80% of its overseas trade, and its GDP fell by 50%. This was traumatic and would have affected relations of any type in any country.
The financial crisis was so severe that industry and agriculture collapsed. The nation was on the brink of widespread famine. Many people were forced to rely on financial support from exiled relatives in the United States, most of whom were the white middle-class people who had fled when the revolution triumphed.
I went to the USA at the end of the 90s, and I found out that 97% of the Cubans living there consider themselves to be white. And so the hundreds of millions, or some say billions of dollars sent to Cuba every year end up in the hands of those who consider themselves white. That in itself is also creating significant economic and social differences.
As we might expect, the surge in inequality had profound consequences for Cuba's race relations.
30 años después de haber triunfado la revolución, quedaban circulando
30 years on from the triumph of the revolution, there were still some racist germs, and they multiplied at an astounding rate. It was incredible. It was as if the immune system had failed, and this disease was taking hold of society.
Money being sent from abroad is one reason for this new race divide. The other is internal. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, two currencies have emerged in Cuba: the peso and the cuc, which is worth 25 times more than the peso.
How much? In pesos or cucs?
This two-tiered currency has turned Cuba's economic structure upside down. While professors and doctors being paid in pesos earn $20 a month, a waiter being paid in cucs can earn $20 a day. I've come to meet Professor Roberto Zurbano to find out how this two-tiered currency might affect black people.
I've been many places in Cuba, and as a black American, I always look for black people. Always. When I walk in. I do this in America too. But here, I see very few black people on airplanes, in hotels, or in restaurants. Why?
Lamentablemente es así. Unfortunately, that's the way it is. Maybe they clean the rooms, or they work in the kitchen, or in a performance. You may see some black people who come in, do the performance and leave. They're likely to be paid in pesos rather than cucs, which is a strong currency. In Cuba, there are few black people in the strong economic sectors. Why? Because prejudice never went away. Prejudice never disappeared. It was simply concealed under the table. The silence allowed all the problems to continue to grow under the table.
I'm meeting one of the most famous writers in Cuba, Miguel Barnett. Miguel believes that one way of dealing with the silence surrounding racist attitudes against blacks is through education.
The knowledge that people have of the African legacy comes from the roots, comes from the family. But I want that to be taught in the university, in the schools, in the primary schools. That's one of the things, the issues I raised at the parliament. We have to introduce more of the African mythology, the African history in our school. The idea that the blacks in this country, the Africans in this country, their legacy is not only cultural or philosophical or artistic, it's also they contributed very strongly to the economy of this country.
Cuban intellectuals might be demanding change, but according to many younger black people, the intellectuals aren't speaking loudly or urgently enough. And this leads to another problem. Since freedom of speech never has been one of Fidel Castro's strong suits, declaring that racism exists can be judged a seditious criticism of the government. After all, didn't socialism end racism?
I'm on my way to interview one of Cuba's leading hip-hop artists. His name is Su Andres. He's recorded 2 songs about racism in Cuba which have been banned. I wanted to record him at his upcoming gig, but the government wouldn't give me permission.
Yo, el negro cubano quiere ser igual que blanco porque cree que lo oscuro es atrás y lo claro adelanto. Tanto así que siempre está riéndose del mismo carcajadas cuando escucha algún chiste de racismo. El negro cubano discrimina a su hermano, le levanta la mano y aunque no tiene amo, se arrastra como gusano que no tiene nada suyo, pues tiene rota la autoestima.
So Andres grew up in the shadow of 1989, and through hip-hop is now trying to wage a war on racism.
I heard that you have 2 songs about racism. You're performing tomorrow night and you can't sing them. Is that true? And why? And how does that make you feel?
Bueno, de cantarla yo la puedo cantar, pero sé que van a traer problemas.
Well, I'm kind of allowed to sing them, but doing so will cause trouble. Trouble that in the long run won't only involve me, it will put at risk the success of the concert and my colleagues, because the concert could end right there and then. I could maybe sing that song tomorrow, but the next person may not be allowed on stage. That would be a loss for the rap movement. We want hip-hop to continue.
Yo, El negro cubano quiere ser igual que blanco porque cree que lo oscuro es atrás y lo claro adelanto.
It is true that racial issues in Cuba are censored not only in rap music, but in paintings, in visual arts, and on television.
Despite experiencing direct and indirect punishment for fighting Cuba's racist attitudes, So Andres and other leading rappers are determined to persist.
Many of us have been criticized for what we do. But the majority of us haven't stopped doing it because this is our reality. When you accept your reality, at least you have the courage to face what is happening, and at least you can begin working on how to fix it. I think it's better to face things like this than to push them aside and pretend that they don't exist.
We did manage to sneak our cameras into So Andres' gig. Just as soul musicians 80 years ago helped change social attitudes towards black people, these hip-hop artists are determined to use their music to keep racial discrimination in the consciousness of their generation, hoping to eradicate it from Cuban society forever. The Cuban Revolution of 1959 pledged to end racism forever. Was it successful? Well, to some extent it was, and to some extent it wasn't. Institutional racism ended virtually overnight. Legal racism, formal racism. What didn't end was a racism of the heart, of the mind, the racism that's a fundamental part of the fabric of this society. Will that ever change? Well, judging from the Afro-Cuban intellectuals whom I've interviewed, I think that it will. And perhaps then we'll see the next Cuban Revolution.